The relatively conservative New York art scene was shaken up for about 5 years, beginning in 1958 and lasting until 1963, when this new thing began to occur. These things were labeled happenings in 1959, and they were the big thing for a while, at least for a certain segment of New York. It wasn't um, the mainstream of New York, but instead the avant-garde for these younger artists who had not yet broken through to major success. There was a whole new game in town, and we're going to take a look at these happenings and what they consisted of, and particularly talk about their origins. Happenings were the creation of one man. His name was Alan Caprow. He was somebody who had studied art at college, and he'd gotten his master's degree in art history. And he had painted, he had been a painter, and he was starting to lose interest in painting and moving away from the act of painting and instead just thinking about other things involved in painting rather than the paint part of it. He took a class with John Cage, who you might remember from our discussion of Rauschenberg, a collaborator with Rauschenberg, the composer of 4 minutes 33 seconds. Now Cage was giving classes at the New School of Social Research in New York City, and it was a major draw for a lot of people in New York who were interested in the ideas of John Cage and Buddhism and his interesting notions about chance and silence and a number of other things. And so Alan Caprow attended these lectures by Cage, and actually a whole bunch of other artists who will later become very important in other movements, like the minimalist movement especially, but some other things that we'll see as we come along, as we go along. But so in 1958, he published an article in Art News magazine, available on newsstands everywhere, so it wasn't some out-of-the-way journal, called The Legacy of Jackson Pollock. And in that, he first used the term happening, and he would later go on to declare happenings a new medium in artistic creation. He's also going to later on use the term environment and make that become more of a term associated with art installations and things like that. So in The Legacy of Jackson Pollock in 1958, I've pulled out some quotes that are interesting, but there's also I can't remember if it's a PDF or it's a link in Canvas for you to read yourself. It's not too terribly long. You can do it. Caprow believed that it wasn't the paintings that Jackson Pollock produced, but it was his act of painting that was the most important aspect of his work. And it was enormously influential to Caprow's thinking in the same way that it was influential to the artists of Gutai that we saw already, or some of the artists elsewhere around the world. And this is part of what he wrote. Objects of every sort are materials for the new art. An odor of crushed strawberries, a letter from a friend, or a billboard selling Drano. 3 raps on the front door, a scratch, a sigh, or a voice lecturing endlessly, like me, a blinding staccato flash, a bowler hat, all will become material for this new concrete art. So he's looking to this way of no longer distinguishing between art and life, that it's the art of the everyday. And of course, by 1958, when he's writing this, we've already got Rauschenberg in New York making things, questioning things, challenging the legacy of the abstract expressionists. And Alan Caprow believes that this is going to become the new art. And in some ways, he's very predictive of the future, because artists today are artists who don't feel like they have to be limited to any one medium to be a painter or a sculptor or whatever. Artists today are kind of cross-trained and cross-disciplinary, and they think of creation as not limited or defined by medium. And so what he's talking about in 1958 is very true of the art world today in many ways. He says, artists of today no longer need to say, I am a painter or a poet or a dancer. They are simply artists. All of life will be open to them. They will discover out of ordinary things the meaning of ordinariness. They will not try to make them extraordinary, but out of nothing they will devise the extraordinary and then maybe nothingness as well. Sounds contradictory, but if you think about it for a little bit, it's really very true. So if you think back to the Rauschenberg lecture when I was talking to you about the event at the Black Mountain College in 1952, and I said it was considered the first happening, it certainly wasn't called a happening. That name didn't come about until 1958. But also think about it in terms of it was sort of roughly structured. You know, they had an idea of what they were going to do as they set out that day to create something. John Cage knew that he was going to read the lecture. Merce Cunningham knew that he was going to dance among the people, the audience members. He did not know a dog would follow him. So they were open to bits of chance encounters and spontaneity and things like that. And that's kind of what happenings are about, even though they didn't know that's what it was in 1952. There's this openness to some kind of things happening that you don't plan for. So it's not exactly like a scripted theater where things happen on a stage and as the audience you're passive. Capra wanted the audience to be actively involved. He wanted them to be very close to the people that were part of the happenings. But he also believed that the artist needed to have a lot more control. And you'll see that there's a variety of opinions about this. Some artists want to have these kind of loose, spontaneous types of experiences, while others want things very strictly structured. And Capra definitely fell in the strictly structured part of this. So you're looking at his script for the very first happening that occurred in New York City, 18 happenings in 6 parts. There's the cover of it as it's been reprinted, and just some of the instructions. So it was a very preordained, planned type of experience that Alan Caprow had intended. So the happening was planned for one evening. It was to take place in a gallery, and you'll find that some happenings only happen once and others are repeated, again, kind of like a performance. This one was only a one-shot deal, although some people reconstructed it many years later. But the gallery itself was divided into 6 different spaces, and you can see on the left the plans for some of those spaces written by Alan Caprow, and then them constructing the space. So these 6 spaces were divided by this semi-transparent film that kind of looks like saran wrap or something, but it was thicker than that, that contained actions in these 6 spaces. And in these 6 spaces, there were going to be 3 sets of actions that were to occur. And as the audience arrived, they were given instructions. They were given instructions on what to do, where to go, when to clap. It was very much controlled by Caprow, what they were to do. And the idea was that each of the audience was divided into 6 sections, and each of them filed through the different rooms where they saw actions being performed. In fact, here are some of the instructions that the audience was given when they arrived. The instructions said, in part, the performance is divided into 6 parts. Each part contains 3 happenings which occur at once. The beginning and end of each will be signaled by a bell. At the end of the performance, 2 strokes of the bell will be heard. There will be no applause after each set, but you may applaud after the 6th set if you wish. So that's what you are to do, and you are to follow these instructions to the best of your ability. The overall performance took 90 minutes, so it was an hour and a half of shuffling between these 6 different rooms. and the performers just repeated the action that they had just done over and over again. They had received careful instructions on what to do, although there was no rehearsal for them because there was something about doing it for the first time in front of an audience that was part of the creative act of a happening. Two of the performers in this very first happening were none other than Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns. So their assignment in their space was one of them would stand on one side of this canvas and paint lines, and the other would stand on the other side of the canvas and paint circles. And when the bell went off, the canvas would rotate, and then the other one would paint circles, and the other one would paint lines on the opposite side. So it was just this meaningless painting of just shapes with no real content, and this is one of the results. In another one of these spaces, a woman methodically and repeatedly squoze oranges in an orange juice squeezer to make orange juice that nobody got to drink. And in another space, musicians alternated between facing the audience and turning and played notes intermittently on the instruments that they held. Here's more about happenings from Alan Kaprow, explaining kind of what they are and what they aren't. A happening, unlike a stage play, may occur at a supermarket, driving along a highway, under a pile of rags, and in a friend's kitchen, either at once or sequentially. If sequentially, time may extend to more than a year. The happening is performed according to plan, but without rehearsal, audience, or repetition. It is art, but seems closer to life. And that's really what Kaprow was getting at. The same thing that Rauschenberg was. This idea about art and life and operating in that gap between the two. You know, Rauschenberg was trying to do that with his combines, and Kaprow didn't describe it in the same way, but he kind of fell more to the side that art should be life, and that's what this was. In 1961, Kaprow gave his audience a more jarring experience when he had a spring happening performed. In this, the audience entered into a darkened chamber, and they had to line up in these like tunnels that you can see on the left, made out of wood, and stand in line. And the lights were darkened, and then bright flashing lights, strobe lights, were going off, and loud noises were played. And so it was very unsettling and very jarring. And then at a certain point, when it was over with, a power lawnmower was started, and somebody with a blank expression on his face, you can see him there on the right, started heading down these rows where people were lined up, and they had to turn around and exit, and that was the conclusion of the event. So it was kind of sensory deprivation and an immersive experience, and really overwhelming to the senses. 1961 was also the year he did another of his happenings. It was titled The Yard, and it was about 1,200 tires that he brought into the back courtyard of a gallery and piled them up, and then he also wrapped some things in tar paper that were back there, and the audience was just invited to climb over the tires. And so it wasn't really a timed happening in the sense of his previous ones. Instead, it was more open-ended, and it was really more like an environment than a happening in a sense. He liked it enough that over the next, years of his career, he reinvented it 10 separate times. The work on the left is the original, and then on the right is a version from California in 1966. He considered these new ones reinventions rather than recreations because the circumstances were always different, and the effect, the feel, the intention was always different than the original. And here are simply two more of these reinventions of the yard. In 1962, Alan Caprow did the happening known as Words, and in Words, he filled this gallery space, which consisted of two rooms with just words and words and words and words written on placards, written on torn pieces of bed sheets, written in chalk on the walls, graffiti on the walls. It was words, 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 words. So you entered it into this space and you were inundated with these words. The first room is a room that had three record players playing, and they were all of Alan Caprow speaking words, just single words like car, sky, elephant. And you could play these three records simultaneously or singly. Um, and you were encouraged to look at the words, to write your own words. There were pieces of blank paper that were left out for people to write their own words in the first room. And also there was blinking red and white lights. And then you walked into the second room, which was painted blue. So you've got this red, white, and blue theme going on. So this idea of words and freedom and America is kind of a subliminal message here. This idea of freedom of speech or these freedoms to use words. In the back room, the walls have been painted blue, like I said, and there was chalk, and you could write on the walls, write words on the walls, or draw on the walls. There were also words hanging from the ceiling in that room as well. Um, well, I'll go on to the next slide. Also in that back room, which was darker because of the blue paint, there was another record player, and the record player was playing whispered words. There's only one, and in order to hear that, you had to get down on your knees and kneel down before the record player in order to hear that above the sounds of other people in the space. So it was really kind of an interesting total immersion. Again, what he's really done is created an environment. It's not a structured happening in terms of having a beginning and end, like we saw with 18 happenings in 6 parts. But this is something that you could enter and leave, whenever you were ready. He described it by talking about just being overwhelmed with words. You're in a city with billboards, newspapers, scrawled pavements, alley walls, whispered secrets, pitchmen in Times Square, fun parlors, bits of stories and conversation overheard at the automat, and just trying to bring awareness to this experience that we have, this sensory overload, by literally overloading your senses. Probably the most well-known of Caprow's happenings was Household, which he did in 1964, which is kind of technically after our window of happenings, but it was something that was, by this point, pretty much institutionalized. In fact, it was a happening that was sponsored by Cornell University. They paid Caprow to come and do this. And so what he came up with is he created a happening that took place in the city dump. And he got two groups of students, a group of females and a group of males, and he divided them up. And he also had a whole group of spectators that drove to the site all in one line of cars. And from the cars, they had banners hanging on their car, like on the antenna, and the banners said banner on them. And they arrived, and then this scene unfolded where the women, the group of female students, were instructed to build a nest out of junk in the junkyard. And so they did. They built a circular nest, and then they hung some clothes. This is all stuff they found in the dump. And it was, dumps back in these days were kind of toxic, sludgy, scary places. Like there's no way a university lawyer would ever let this happen today. But, back in the middle 60s, what the heck. So the women made their nest. They hung some clothes on on the line, and the males were given the task of building a tower. So they made a junk tower, and so they've got this phallic tower and this kind of circular nest for the women. So what they're really doing is they're playing out the battle of the sexes, essentially men versus women, this age old kind of dynamic. And it's really quite interesting because this is before a lot of the later 1960s um, serious um, interrogations about gender, interrogations about sex. The rise of the women's movement was just starting now and hadn't made the greatest impact yet that it would. And so this, and also at this time, student protests hadn't occurred. So this is this interesting, innocent window in American life. But this happening really kind of foretells all the stuff that would happen in the next 10 years. So it's interesting in that sense. So anyway, once they had built the nest and the tower, then the men came over and oh well, the men then after the tower was complete, they kind of pounded on their chest and did some man roars, and then they went and found a car, and then they pushed the car to the tower. They then covered the car with jelly. And then the women were drawn out by the car and the jelly, and they began to lick the jelly off the car. While they were doing that, the men then went and destroyed their nest and took great joy in destroying this nest. The women then responded by running over to the tower and destroying their tower. And once they had done that, then they yelled, they tore off their shirts, the women did, and waved them in the air, and they continued to taunt the men about how they have destroyed their tower. Then the women all marched to a line of cars, got in the cars, and went back to campus, while the men started lighting off smoke bombs and throwing them in the air. And then they took the car and removed the tires from it and set it on fire. And then they all sat around and watched this happen, this fire burn of the car. Meanwhile, while this was all happening, the spectators were slowly moving in to watch the action. So by the time it was done, you had these kind of band of men, band of women play acting. It was very much like child acting, like you do when you're a kid, and you have forts and you have teams and you have these little wars and dramas. Nobody was hurt in all of this. It was all just, kind of fun for everybody. And then the spectators arrive as the women are leave. Well, they get closer, and after the women leave, everybody sits and watches the car burn, like I said, and they eat jam sandwiches or jelly sandwiches. So sugar rush for everybody. Fun, huh? Don't you wish Green Bay would do something like that? Some photos of that day's activity that happening. Unfortunately, I couldn't get very high resolution images, so they're kind of blurry. But you can see on the left, these are the women tearing down the men's tower, and there's the men's tower below. It looks kind of nice, actually. And there's the men shooting off their smoke bombs, throwing their smoke bombs up in the air. And there's also something kind of sexual about this, sexual about these activities. Obviously, the phallic tower, the kind of womb-like space of the nest, and the men throwing up their smoke bombs, like kind of jerking off together, and then doing something violent. Then like smoking a cigarette when it's all done, except the women have left. It's very interesting. It's a very interesting happening. By 1966, Alan Caprow had left the East Coast and moved to California. And he'd be a really important part of a growing conceptual art movement that was very strong and solid in California, which we'll be talking about in some upcoming weeks. He was a teacher. He always was a professor, so that's how he earned his living. And in fact, he made no money off of these happenings. They were all, there's no way to recoup money. He didn't sell photographs of them afterwards or anything like that. He always gained his salary through being a professor. So that was important to him. It was important that happenings were not part of the capitalist art system in America, that they were outside of that, that they were these creative expressions of just engagement. So that was important. So one of the last happenings that he does, except for his later reinterpretations, would be Fluids. And Fluids is, again, this sort of a happening about nothing. It's not quite as dramatic and exciting as Household, but he built these ice block constructions, and then the whole point was just to watch them melt into water. So about 20 of these over the course of 3 days were constructed all around the city of Los Angeles, and the point was to build them and then just to watch them melt. And California wishes they had that water back now. By around 1966, happenings had really gone mainstream. People were talking about them. In fact, when happenings began to start to go south is when Alan Kaprow noticed that the people that were now attending were people from the suburbs who were coming into New York, who had heard about this far out and groovy thing going on. And so it was people that weren't really committed to avant-garde ideals, to challenging ideas about what art is, taking it seriously. Instead, it became the spectacle that, suburban, soccer dads were going into the city to see, and they weren't the same type of receptive audience. And so Alan Kaprow felt like he was needed to end them. Also, the Supremes came out with a song called "The Happening," and there was even an advertisement for a bra. Maidenform bras began to have this ad campaign early actually in the 1950s, called "I Dreamed that Something Happened to Them," and then the ad was all about this woman in her maidenform bra. And there was one that said, "I dreamed that I went to a happening." And unfortunately, I cannot find that advertisement. So this is the closest one I could find. "I dreamed I swung to a new beat in my maidenform confections." But that was the gist of the ad. And when he saw that happenings were now being mentioned in advertisement, he thought, no, I can't do these in good conscience, in good faith any longer. So he stopped doing them and calling them happenings, but he increasingly came to believe that just those things that he had first written about could be considered to be important. And he taught them in the classes that he continued to teach for 20 some years after this, and he lived them. So he would do things, and he called them actions, and he also called them unart. And so, for example, the reason I have these images up here is that him and a colleague would trade buckets of dirt back and forth, and that was an action that they did. Or him and a friend of his each made a promise and then carried through with it, that they would wash the other's kitchen floor using only their saliva and Q-tips. And so those types of actions, promised and then delivered, were this thing that Alan Kaprow lived throughout the rest of his life. And then later he would write about them, so that's why we know that he did them. He wrote about integrating it into his everyday life. It's Tuesday, so it's my day to fill a bucket of dirt and give it to Fred or whoever. So this was his way of making art, which wasn't art, that was every day, that was just a part of his normally scheduled life. Alan Kaprow was not the only one who did happenings. He was the originator of them, but a number of people in his circle and surrounding him did these happenings. And in fact, they had whole evenings of happenings where multiple artists would present their happening, almost like in a theater like setting. So the only female, the only woman artist who did her own happenings, who conceived them and then choreographed them and made instructions for them, was a woman by the name of Simone Forti, and she did two happenings that are both very focused on the body and on and movement, dance. She is right now, she's still alive. She's considered a very famous choreographer, modern dance advocate, and she helped to shape this new form of modern dance going into the 1970s and 1980s. But so this was a work that she did titled Seesaw, in which she had two performers that began seesawing and then did a number of other bodily movements. And her works are really dance works, but they were considered happenings at the time. The second one was titled Rollers, and it consisted of these boxes that were on wheels, and dancers who were in the boxes, and they were being pulled on these ropes by other people, and then they just sort of started pulling them really fast, and it kind of got out of control, and the audience members got involved, and it was very much sort of playful in the same vein as Household was this sort of chance for adults to be kids for a little while again, and these rollers like crashed into walls and things. Nobody was hurt though. Red Grooms was a very early practitioner of happenings. His happenings, he would go on to become pretty famous as a sculptor in the 1960s and 70s, even into the 80s, kind of making comic-y like sculptures of different things like the city and things. But in the late 50s and early 60s, he was considered one of these downtown artists who was part of the happening scene. And he made these happenings that were really more play-like. His ones were like theater. He had costumes for himself and for the other players. There were sets that were constructed. I mean, out of cheap material. All of this stuff was cheap because nobody had any money. And so, they just used whatever they could. No budgets for these things. But he nevertheless managed to construct different sets, and he would create scenarios, really, the walking man, the burning building, the magic train ride, in which characters were created, but then never really developed into anything. And the narrative wasn't a narrative, it was just kind of a situation in a way. One critic described them like this, that it was drama with structure but no plot, words but no dialogue, actors but no characters, and above all, nothing logical or continuous. That wasn't really meant to be flattering praise, but it certainly is accurate as to what these happenings were about. They were to confound you, they were to transport you, they were to make you think about the artificiality between stage and life, and all of these things. There wasn't really audience participation in the same way with Red Grooms' works. They were more, the audience was more passive in them. And just looking from these images, these are the last ones in this set are all from Burning Building from 1960. You can sense how theatrical it is. The makeup is like the mime makeup or clown makeup, and it's this situational experience. You can see that they've made sets out of cardboard that's cut into the shape of flames and then painted. So it's like a kid's production. There's a certain sense of child's play in all of happenings. It's this attempt to kind of break out of the rigid structure of adulthood and to engage with a little bit more spontaneity and imagination. Another artist who had a very different take on what happenings should be was Claes Oldenburg, who would later go on to fame as a pop artist. But he studied in Chicago, and while he was there, he was with a group of artists who had a lot of respect for Dubuffet over in Paris, and also Francis Bacon in England, and just this idea of this primitive force and primitive power on the one hand with Dubuffet, but also the sense of anxiety and just this fear of the social stresses that we lived under at that time. And so when he gets to New York, he is really impacted by the poverty around him. He came from a, a wealthy upbringing, basically. His father was an ambassador from uh, Sweden to this country, and he he lived among the poverty. He wasn't living off of his father's wealth per se, and he was looking for a way to express that. And he created this room-size installation, which he called the Street. And he wanted to convey a sense of the decrepitude of the city, that it wasn't all gleaming towers and, you know, a gung-ho advertising industry and yay yay Wall Street, but that there was serious cracks in the facade of American wealth in the 1950s. And so he creates the street as this place that is full of trash and barren. He uses cardboard mostly to construct it. He burns the edges and tears them apart so they look like they were chewed up by rats. Fills this space with trash and things he finds on the streets. And this itself he considered to be a work of art, the street, this installation, this room. He became more and more interested in theater and in happenings. He also adopted an alter ego called Ray Gun, and Ray Gun was the actor within him, and he created Ray Gun Theater as the sort of like production unit for the happenings that he would perform. So, along with Patty Muka, who was an artist from Milwaukee, yay, Wisconsin, and who had become his first wife, and they were married for about 10 years, they together performed this bit that he did called Snapshots from the City, which they performed in the space of the street. So, an audience was invited to come, and this artist by the name of Lucas Samaras was in the back, and he flipped the lights on and off 32 times. And every time he turned them off, or excuse me, every time he turned them on, the two actors, Klaus Oldenburg and Patty Muka, froze in these postures, these positions of anxiety and angst and anguish and pain. And it was meant to communicate just some of the unexpressed pain of poverty, of living in filth that Oldenburg had witnessed and wanted more and more people to be aware of it. So there's a real social message from Oldenburg in Snapshots from the Street. I should say, too, that before Lucas Samara started to flip the lights, it was all dark, and so the audience only heard Klaus Oldenburg and Patty Muka kind of moaning and making these whimpering sounds and sounds of distress. And that went on for about 15 minutes. And then Lucas Samaras, when he was switching the lights on and off, he did that totally at his own discretion. So Oldenburg and Muka never really knew when he was going to flip the lights on or off. So that was all part of the unexpected aspect of this particular happening. In the next 2 years that Oldenburg was involved with making happenings, he often focused on this anxiety of America, this middle class tension and drama that people just didn't speak about. The screams of the street people are transformed in Necropolis 2 to this kind of mid-American family who is eating at the table and kind of ignoring each other. They've got these creepy aluminum masks on. The man is reading an aluminum newspaper. It's just this strange attempt to visualize the underlying tensions of the picture perfect American family. His performance of sports was this kind of indictment of the bedlam and buffoonery of sports fans and of the attention America pays to sports at the exclusion of other things that might be more important. So his his baseball players that are here have this oversized bat and just kind of buffoonish behavior. The stands are littered with all kind of trash and things at the end. By the end of the um, mocked sports performance, and it's just that kind of uh, critical eye cast on American society that really fascinated Oldenburg. But he was only involved for about 2.5 years, and then he kind of stopped with this happening scene. Jim Dine falls into the same type of happenings that Klaus Oldenburg was interested in. These are ones that are kind of rough and critical and slightly ugly. Jim Dine was particularly interested in expressing aspects of his own life and being kind of using them as an emotional catharsis and having an audience watch that as he performed it. So his earliest performance was The Smiling Workman from 1959, and it's just him on stage. And typically, in most of his happenings, he was just by himself. He walks onto this darkened stage dressed as a clown. His face is painted gold and red, and he starts painting in this on this kind of haggard-looking canvas, messy-looking thing. I love what I'm doing. Help! And then he turns to the audience and takes a big drink out of his paint bucket of red paint, and then he pours it all over his head. Turns out it was just tomato juice for those of you worried about his digestive system. And then he jumps through the canvas that he had just painted, so he destroys it. So it's kind of like this Pollock-like figure in a way. This figure beset by personal problems, and there's lots of interesting overtures going on with The Smiling Workman that Jim Dine constructed. In Jim Dine's Car Crash from 1960, he uses his own experience of being in 2 car crashes the previous year to really kind of, again, be this catharsis for the trauma and the brutality of car collisions that were so prevalent, particularly in those days, and so often fatal. In this piece, he shares the stage with 2 performers. I think it's Patty Muka again, and Lucas Samaras, who's an artist too that we'll see. And he dresses up as the personification of a car, and there are 2 cars as well. And he is dressed all in silver, and he paints his face silver, and he makes car noises, and he goes vroom vroom around the audience, and so do they. They have headlights. They're carrying flashlights that are headlights, but his headlights are out. And then he kind of simulates a car crash, and then he tries to communicate with the audience by drawing these pictures, and he can't quite get it. And again, it's this kind of very uncomfortable, emotional, frustrating kind of experience for the audience. It's only 15 minutes, so it doesn't last too long, but his inability to communicate his pain and his terror and his really just trauma is part of what he's trying to communicate to the audience. Here he is trying to draw on this chalkboard and communicate to the audience in the middle of the happening. And prior to it, as the character of the car, he made these very kind of primitive, rough, graphic images, drawings that again are childlike and kind of intense. In the image you see above, that's one of his car crash drawings. He did a number of them. In the late 50s and early 1960s, there was another vibe going on in New York City that was related to happenings and was also connected to particularly Robert Rauschenberg. And that is this, a number of artists were creating what's known as junk sculpture. Today is known as junk sculpture. It wasn't really at the time. And also those who are exploring the aesthetic of everyday life, like Happenings, like Rauschenberg, trying to figure out where art fit into everyday life and understanding that it did, unlike the abstract expressionists who said art was completely separate from everything else. So I want to look at a few of these artists because they don't really fit into neat categories of other major movements. So we'll look at Jim Dine first. He was associated with Happenings, as you just saw. He's sometimes considered a pop artist, but he never really considered himself a pop artist. Instead, he thinks of himself as coming in the line of Rauschenberg and Johns, and he considers himself more of a neo-Dada artist, in the same vein that they do. And he did a lot of artwork that kind of combined the idea of art and the ready-made. So, for example, a painting with tools on the left is just that, a painting with tools. He paints this color field image, but then he incorporates actual objects onto its surface. On the right is another work of his from the same period where he takes clothing and he applies shoes and then he paints this face underneath it, and it's got this look of layering and almost like a combine of Rauschenberg's, but it's not. It kind of crosses the line again of painting, sculpture. You're not quite clear. And that's much more typical of Jim Dine, and he's, I think, a lot more comfortably considered a neo-Dadaist. And it's really this late 50s, early 60s work that is probably the strongest of Jim Dine's career, besides the work he did with Happenings. This is simply titled Two Shovels, but it's a very interesting combination of what he's trying to do. It's literally like art and life, this conundrum, and he's bringing it together. With Rauschenberg, you have a feeling that he's often critiquing painting while he is layering and putting his objects onto it. And you don't get a sense of that with Dine. You get a sense that he almost respects both. Red Suspenders on the left, where he literally uses red suspenders over this painting, or a work also from the same period titled Green Suit, where you've got this literally suit that becomes a surface to be painted on. The pants have become torn. Again, it's the sense of alienation, of decrepitude. This suit looks dirty. It looks like it has seen some better days. And you think of Suits and American Businessmen and this whole corporate model, and he's suggesting that it is kind of vacant or empty. This work is titled 5 Feet of Colorful Tools, and it's kind of a fun, playful image where the tools are painted and not much else on this canvas except for the strip upon which they are hung. And you see a couple of drips on the canvas below them. One of my favorites from this early period from 1962 is his white bathroom wall, where he just literally reconstructs things that you'd find in a bathroom, towels hanging off of towel rods, a toilet paper roll, you've got some toothbrush holders over there, a soap holder. It's just kind of brilliant. And one of the reasons I think it's particularly brilliant is that it riffs off of an earlier 20th century work by Kazimir Malevich, who was a Russian suprematist who created these abstract paintings that were supposed to be the epitome of spirituality, these like higher powers. And his white on white image here that you see on the right is one of these really important paintings in the history of total abstraction, because it is this painting that's beyond the world. It's transformational, and what Jim Dine does is he really brings it down to earth. This white on white that he does is all about cleaning up after your body and dealing with bodily excretions and things like that. So it's not, art is not about the transcendent. art is about the here and now for Jim Dine. While Klaus Oldenburg was still doing his happenings, he also began another practice that was more sculptural. He created an installation that he called the Store in 1961, and he literally set up a store in the Green Gallery, a gallery that was devoted to the weird and the offbeat in New York at the time, and showed some great art. And he set up basically like a bodega, like a little shop that you would find on any street corner in New York. And he actually worked there, and he sold his pieces, these sculptures that he made out of paper mache and out of plaster, and he sold them for very cheap price, like what you would pay for the object in the actual store. He actually did this installation, you could even call it a performance, since he worked in the store while it was open. Twice he did it in 1962 as well, where he actually rented out a storefront for a month and did it. He called his endeavor Ray Gun Manufacturing Company, sort of a riff on the Ray Gun theaters that he did while he was performing. And of course, Ray Gun was his alter ego. You can see from the photographs of the store, these things that he created are not pretty. They're ugly, they're sloppy, they're drippy, they're messy. These paper mache dresses for little girls are creepy, just downright creepy. And the other things that were for sale there are not really that much better. Klaus Oldenburg also became associated with the pop art movement in just a couple of years, and you can see why by recreating America's consumer products like the 7-Up can or Converse sneakers. But he also is commenting on them too by having the runny paint. They look used. They look like the trash of our consumer society. They don't look brand new and fetishized like most pop artists would do. And here are some more of these early plaster things, the drippy American flag and the crusty American flag and the drippy Pepsi Cola. The dessert rack in on the left is a little bit nicer. It's from his second iteration of the store in 1962, and you can see it's not quite as grotesque. Robert Whitman also was a happenings artist, and the happening that I thought you would appreciate the most is this one from 1959 titled E.G. It was kind of like an opera that Whitman created to be a happening. And E.G. stands for Ed Gein, the Wisconsin psychopath who cut people up in his squalid Wisconsin home. And the news of Ed Gein was just getting out to the public at this point. And Robert Whitman was fascinated with the story and fascinated with townspeople who knew Ed Gein. And so this is just a scene from The Happening where these two women wearing these suits are cut open by Robert Whitman, and some of their stuffing is pulled out in kind of an ode to the house of horrors that Ed Gein oversaw during his murderous spree. Robert Whitman didn't always go for the grotesque and the macabre. He's often considered the most poetic of all the happenings artists, so I kind of feel bad that I showed you this, but, Ed Gein, how can you not? He also did a number of sculptures that I find very interesting. This door sculpture, they would be untitled sculptures, but this door with other items kind of looks like a combine without all the paint. Or he did also a series of paintings that he used aluminum foil and tape, masking tape, scotch tape, gold leaf in some instances, and he did a whole series of them. Unfortunately, I could only get one image to show you, but here it is. A lot of them didn't survive. So he was definitely involved in this kind of junk everyday aesthetic, but that's not really didn't really consume him for the rest of his career. He went on to become really very interested in technology and combining technology with art. He worked with Robert Rauschenberg for a while with his interests in technology and bridging the science and art gap. And Robert Whitman became very interested in new technology. And as an artist, he explored that for the rest of his career, moving away from this junk kind of stage of his aesthetic. Before we leave him, though, I did want to highlight just two works that he does in the early 60s as he's starting to become more and more interested in technology. And these are these installations, these sculptures that have very simple titles. This is Window from 1962. And what it is a film. It's a film that's being projected so that as the viewer, you stand in front of this paneled wall and you look out the window and you see this nude woman kind of moving through the brush. Sorry if you can hear that snoring, that's my dog. I'm just used to students snoring, so it doesn't bother me, but I hope it's okay with you. He's very comfortable right now. I don't want to move him. So you've got this sculpture that's this wall. It looks like the interior of a basement or something, and then you're looking at a naked woman outside. It's like you're at your cabin up north or something, and Eve is running around out there. So it's kind of strange. It's not something you see every day, but it's also extremely ordinary in its presentation of just this wall, this interior of an everyday space. It almost makes you feel like you're on a movie set or something, so it's got that artificiality to it as well. So a lot of interesting things going on there. Another work that he does in 1963, and it's really shocking that these were done in 62 and 63. I've actually seen both of them in real life, and they seem very contemporary. Even though the images, the projected image seems kind of dated, but they're fascinating objects. So the shower is literally a shower, and what you're seeing is this projection onto the shower curtain of a woman taking a shower, and at a certain point the water runs red. Kind of reminds you of Psycho, the movie that was released in 1960, and then other times it's just the regular water. But it's this object that is a sculpture of a shower, but it's an actual shower, and there's somebody actually showering in it. So again, the line between reality and art is really heavily blurred here in the work of Robert Whitman in what is really a fun way to experience these spectacles. On the opposite end of the spectrum from Robert Whitman is Richard Stankiewicz, who really embodies the idea of junk sculpture because he takes old rusted industrial parts and he pieces them together. Now we're kind of used to seeing this. Anytime you go to a craft show in the Midwest, you see these guys who are welding these old pieces of rusty metal together. But it really wasn't a thing until the 1950s. I mean, sure, you might see an occasional guy building an old robot out of ductwork and things like that, but these types of things were not typical. So Richard Stankiewicz creates these, objects out of waste, out of junk, literally, and he creates interesting forms. There are a lot of them. A lot of them are very anthropomorphic or human-like. So you can relate to them, and they kind of look robotic, of course, because they're made out of metal. They're like that, old rusty R2-D2 when he gets rediscovered. There's just a certain kind of appeal that I think they have to people. He did works that were both life-size, human life-size, as well as larger, and then also works that were smaller and were tabletop pieces. Here are a couple examples of both. Here's two more. The work on the left, not particularly anthropomorphic, just kind of a bunch of machine parts that are done in interesting composition, interesting angles. They seem like they're moving, they seem like they're dynamic. And then on the other hand, so does the figure that you see on the right, with again the um, diagonal legs and the arm that seems to be holding up some big kind of fan or something. So I don't know. There's not too much to say about these other than that they're kind of fun and whimsical. One of my absolute favorite artists from this period is Jean Follett. In fact, I've been kind of obsessed with her for about 25 years. And that's because she's a mystery. There's not much known about her at all. Not much of her work has survived. She grew up in Minnesota, so she's a Midwestern gal. She moved to New York City in 1946, determined to be an artist. She had this vision of being a great artist. She was fascinated uh, with machines and machine parts and sculpture. And she was sort of just fits in perfectly with this neo-Dadaist movement. That's a drawing of hers on the left that you're looking at, and then a piece of hers titled "The Many-Headed Monster" on the right. She uses these cast-off parts and she pieces them together in these interesting ways, and she often refers to them as, like hybrid creatures or things, but they're not cutesy at all. Instead, they're just kind of fascinating, and you want to just get inside her mind and know what she was thinking. Here she is with one of her pieces on the left, Lady with Open Door Stomach. So, it sounds kind of cutesy title, but it's not a cute work at all. It's just this uh, accumulation of things that she's found, again, scavenging off the street, but she gets things like wire and light switches and electrical things that I don't even know what, because I don't know how to do any of that stuff. And then she assembles them in these really interesting compositions. She uses paint and paints over them. She was enormously influential. She was, what people call an artist's artist. She influenced people like Jim Dine and these others that we've been seeing, Oldenburg, Richard Stankovich. She was somebody that also was kind of difficult. She did not. She took her art very seriously. She made her prices very high that people laughed at. They weren't going to pay that work for that much money for things like this. And consequently, she found very few buyers for her work. And nobody knows why she did that. Maybe she wanted to keep them. She wasn't ready to sell them. Maybe she wasn't interested in commercializing her vision. It's hard to say. This is a work titled Three Bottles. It's kind of in bad shape. Didn't originally look so rough, but the years have not been kind to this piece. And that's the thing with her work. In 1962, her studio burned down, and she lost just a ton of the work that she kind of didn't want to sell. And so there's a surprisingly little amount of things that she made that exist. In fact, only these four things that I'm showing you are ones that are currently in public collections anymore. She was in a number of shows, big shows, major shows, and her work was, like I said, really well respected during her lifetime. But dang, if there's just not very much of it left, at least as far as people know. Because she was in some exhibitions that had catalogs published, we know of some of her work, even though we don't have it any longer. On the right is the lady with the open door stomach, and you can get a little bit sense of that it is kind of anthropomorphic. And then on the right is a work titled Many-Legged Creature. And then finally there's this piece titled Gulliver, very large room size work. So she made these great sculptural works that she called paintings, and she was just a little ahead of her time. People didn't quite know what to do with her. Ultimately, after her studio burned down, she ended up moving back to Minnesota, and the trail goes cold. She died in 1990, and just I wish there was more of her work to show you because I'm in love with her. I don't know why. By way of contrast, John Chamberlain is a junk artist who became extraordinarily famous and probably the most famous of all the junk artists, I would guess. He was somebody who created these sculptures out of car parts, and it was a car culture, at the end of the 50s, moving into the 1960s. There were so many automobiles on the road and in junkyards, and he played around and experimented, and he created objects that are actually very interesting. They kind of speak of car crashes and death in an interesting way without being maudlin or morbid. So they're compelling. I think they're almost like abstract expressionist paintings because they're big and they're bold and they're almost like big brushstrokes of metal. Not the one on the left, that's kind of dumpy and ugly looking. But if you look at the one on the right, you maybe see what I mean. Despite that very early work that I just showed you that was all rusty, he tended not to go for that rust look, that rusted, aged look that you see in Stankovich's work. Instead, he chose cars either with bright colors or he painted with automotive paints in order to kind of lighten up the mood. And these are sculptures that are also very dynamic. They have lots of diagonal lines. They have a sense of motion, and they are really compelling. And they're destruction. So, these are sculptures that dudes like. They're like, yo, I like that art, man. And that anybody can appreciate. And that's kind of the abstract expressionist aesthetic in a way. It's macho. It's sort of full of virility, except it's not really when you think about it, because this is crumpled virility. It's virility that has been mangled and perhaps killed. So there's, I think, interesting layers to that whole macho thing about John Chamberlain's car pieces. He also did wall pieces, so they were like relief sculptures hanging off the wall that again really helped to solidify that connection with abstract expressionism. So even though he's using objects from everyday life, there's still something about these that connects with that transformative vision of abstract expressionism. It's kind of a push and pull effect. It's a car, it's abstraction. It's a car, it's abstraction. That's what I mean. Another artist who was very successful by the end of the 1950s was Louise Nevelson. This is a photograph of her on the left and an early sculpture she did. Gosh, I think it's from the 1930s, maybe early 40s. But Louise Nevelson is an interesting story because she was quite old by the 50s. Well, she was in her 50s. She was born in 1899. She immigrated to this country as a young girl, came from Ukraine. Her parents were, well, her family was Jewish and wanted her to marry a Jewish man, where somebody wealthy, they hoped. So she did, and he was apparently a great guy, and he let her pursue her interest in art, and then he moved her out to the suburbs, and she said, nope, I'm not that kind of wife, and left him, took their young son with her, moved back to New York City, and struggled for 20 years to make a living, to make ends meet, to provide for her son. She never asked her ex-husband for any help, and she made it her own way in the city. She took a number of art classes from people like Hans Hofmann and others. She was painting, she was printmaking, but sculpture was really her passion. And in the 1940s, she turned to essentially making sculptures out of scraps because she couldn't afford materials. She was really poor. So she was creating junk sculptures before they were known as junk sculptures. And finally, the times caught up with her by the 1950s. By that time, she was finding scraps of wood from torn down construction sites. She was bringing them home. Her son often accompanied her to find things for her sculptures. And she sanded them, or she cut them, or she did what she needed to do to them, and then she created these fascinating, like, three-dimensional jigsaw puzzles with the pieces. And then they were all painted black, and they were works that could stand on the ground, that could hang on the wall, depending upon whatever orientation she chose to make them. And people started to notice them when there was this wider appreciation of found object art. She was fascinated with boxes and suitcases and made a number of objects related to that. And at the time, this was a very unique vision that she had. Nobody was doing anything like this. It kind of combined a modernist, sleek aesthetic, probably because everything was painted black. It had sort of shades of Art Deco to it. So it was sort of throwback, and she herself was throwback. She fashioned herself. The photograph I showed you with the heavy eye makeup and the hats and the furs, she shopped at thrift stores. She got things free where she could, but she created this image of herself as a wealthy, successful person. Uh, in this aesthetic that a wealthy, respectable person would never use, kind of like a wealthy street person. It's kind of how she looked in many senses. But she carried herself with such dignity and poise, and so she herself became as famous as an individual as her art did. She was a real personality. Probably the years that critics point to as the most significant for her were the years from about the mid 1950s up to about the early 1970s. And that's when her constructions became more and more intricate, and they got larger and larger scale. They became bigger than life. They became room size as she just kept putting more things into these mysterious boxes. And they're really compelling because of the black paint on the one hand, because of the uniformity, because they're homogeneous, because they're scraps from the street, but they look very clean. There's all kinds of interesting dualities about. There's the mailman. About Louise Nevelson. And really, the brilliance of Louise Nevelson is that the larger they got, the more interesting they became. You don't feel overwhelmed by them just because there's a lot of things in there, because it's all painted the same color. And particularly being black, it's much easier to take. And they have managed to retain their brilliance, I think, even now 50 years after she first created them. In some of them, you can see how she cuts off uh, legs from chairs, from sofas, from beds. There's parts that are like banisters from houses that she has been able to scrounge off the streets and incorporate into these, big boxes. And there's something that's kind of Egyptian about them. They're very stately, and they're immovable objects. They're kind of dead, but not creepy dead, like mummy dead, cool dead. You know what I mean? White was another color that she experimented with for her sculptures. And again, it gives them a different feel, not quite as somber, maybe. We don't associate white with death like we do black with death. But these have just as much sense of being transformed as the black ones do. Everyday objects, but now they are, you can't imagine them as anything other than Louise Nevelson sculpture parts. Here's another one of these great white constructions that starts to become massive, just like her black ones did, and they seem like a huge wall, a big piece of furniture. Um, to me, the white ones are a little bit more cluttery, I think, than the black ones, but still just fantastic. This piece is a room-size installation. It's titled Dawn's Wedding Feast, and you have these elements that are supposed to remind you of a wedding. There's a bride and groom in the center, and then things that evoke churches and matrimony. One final color that she experimented with was gold. Again, black, white, gold, such strong symbolic connotations to it, such a sort of ancient presence they have. Again, the gold evoking, I think, Egyptian qualities. And people often talk about the Egyptian influence in Louise Nevelson, and I don't think they're just talking about her eye makeup. But again, the sense of stillness, the sense of grandeur, the sense of you've wandered into like a time gone by, some ancient civilization. And these found object pieces really have that quality to them. Even more so when you can see them in life, in person. Another grand interior by her, this time in gold. Well, with her massive scale increasing in her interior pieces, it's probably no surprise that she began to get commissions to do outdoor sculptures. And she was commissioned by many cities, not only in the United States, but also around the world. She created these massive things that bear a lot of resemblance to her interior constructions. I think you can see the puzzle-like shapes, and she also always insisted on a singular color for them. I forgot to say that one of her great sources of inspiration was she made a trip to Guatemala, and seeing Mayan sculptures, these large Mayan temples with sculptures on the outside of them, really influenced her sense of scale. And so she was drawing on those, especially when she started doing these outdoor projects. Artist to plug in here is Lucas Samaras because he was also involved in happenings, and he kind of made his own path through the art world. After happenings, he began doing sculptures like these, transforming. These are actually called transformations, chair transformations. And he took chairs and then he would just alter them, either by breaking them down or by covering half of a chair with yarn. He's somebody who then would find his way into photography, and he did a lot of experimental Polaroid photography in the 80s and 90s, especially. But so Lucas Samaras was part of this whole scene at the time, and it was, his belief that everyday objects could become art. Lucas Samaras is never really associated with a particular movement in New York, but he always seems to be around. He's around all kinds of different writers and poets and musicians and especially artists. Lots of different artists considered him a friend. Um, he was very social. I'm surprised he ever had time to work, but he constructed throughout the 60s. He became really known for going to thrift stores and finding little boxes, jewelry boxes, or other types of boxes that people keep stuff in. And he brought them home and he transformed them into these kind of magical objects that kept secrets or kept I don't know, whatever in them. The work on the left is titled Self-Portrait Box, and those are portraits of Lucas Samaras inside this box, but then it's covered with these prickly thin nails all over it. Just like the work on the left is also covered, I don't know if you can see very well, but with very fine little needles. So they're dangerous objects, but they're also beautiful objects at the same time. Here's two more of these boxes. He literally did hundreds of them. He was also a gay man, and some people believe that his interest in the box and things that can open and close and you can show parts but not the whole thing related to his identity as well. That this need to compartmentalize yourself when you can't be your whole self. Finally, two painters who aren't as well known today as they should be. Martha Eidelheit, she's actually known for more of her work in the late 60s and the 1970s as part of a feminist art group. But here in the 50s and early 60s, she was making paintings that people likened to this trash aesthetic, this junk aesthetic. And that's because she was creating these paintings that literally expanded out of the rectangle to encompass these wild shapes, these collaged elements that spilled over the side and the bottom and the top, and took on this appearance of something that was unruly and uncontainable, and does kind of have some of the aesthetic of that junk sculpture. And then finally, Renee Rubin is another painter. She's hardly remembered at all today. Um, for any body of work, but she was producing these shaped canvases that, again, were sculptural at the same time as they were paintings, and really pushing the boundary of what a painting could be or what can be considered a painting. So that's our American happenings and junk art. In our next slide presentation, we are going to go back across the Atlantic Ocean and look at what was happening in France and in Britain. So hang on for that. Stay tuned.